Of course, neocons openly admit their interest in directing, or, and this is Podhoritz's word, aligning with movements in the demos. In a remarkably frank magazine article, Irving Kristol, published in William Kristol, his son's magazine, of course, the not-so-hidden godfather, that is Irving Kristol, the not-so-hidden godfather of neoconservatism, urges the faithful to segregate themselves from major elements within what he calls traditional conservatism. The elements of traditional conservative are these: segregate themselves from market libertarians whose beliefs give priority to economics, from Burkeans, such as Kirk, who embody what Kristol calls Tory nostalgia. And by sleight of hand, Kristol leaves only, and I quote again, religious traditionalists within the larger group traditional conservatives, with whom neoconservatives must ally. Why traditional conservatives? They stand as fit eyes for the neocons, despite the fact that neocons are largely secular, despite the fact that the religious fundamentalists are largely Christian and Baptist, and the neoconservatives largely Jewish. Neocon belief takes form in sectarian utilitarianism, and so an alliance emerges between these strange bedfellows. Kristol writes this: united on issues concerning the quality of education, the relations of church and state, the regulation of pornography, all of which we regard as propaganda candidates for the government's control. Kristol admits that the neocons are fish swimming in the waters of religious fundamentalism for the conditions of their own successful hold on power, indeed of their access to power. Their place within the state comes from a demos well prepared to use state power to police culture and domestic society. Kristol's version of American exceptionalism takes a doubly bizarre form. The US alone has a demographic base of religious conservatives, and so only in the US is, quote, the neoconservative potential strong, quote. And at the same time, although the US is the only possible home for the neocons, Kristol admits, and I quote again, it is only, that is America, it is only to a degree that neocons are comfortable in America, end quote. In Kristol's scheme, American exceptionalism exists as a mode of intensifying itself as a police state that enforces cultural and moral uniformity on a clear sectarian basis. In large part, this reformist effort aims to allow their activism throughout the world, a statism as aggressively imperial and militaristic as any in the ambitions of their admired predecessors. The article ends with this phrase, and then, of course, there's foreign policy. Kristol insists, interesting, this, because it puts the question of reason and argument entirely aside from the beginning. Kristol insists that the neocons have no beliefs in foreign policy, that's his word. He said, we have merely a set of attitudes. And these attitudes are derived from what he calls historical experience, and also from what he calls, again, our favorite text, made so, and I quote again, our favorite text, made so thanks to Professors Leo Strauss of Chicago and Donald Kagan of Yale, great humanists and, of course, sponsors of Bildung. That text, of course, is no other than Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Kristol then goes on to enumerate the attitudes that neocons have, and he enumerates them as theses, saying that in doing so he is mocking Karl Marx. Here are the highlights of neocons' attitudinizing as theses. 1. Patriotism is a natural and healthy sentiment and should be encouraged by both private and public institutions. Precisely because we are a nation of immigrants, this is a powerful American sentiment. World government, too. World government is a terrible idea. It will lead to world tyranny. International institutions that point to an ultimate world government should be regarded with the deepest suspicion. 3. Statesmen should have the ability to distinguish friends from enemies. US statesmen are not sufficiently good at this, either because they're not sufficiently anti-Soviet or, in fact, were communist. 4. The national interest is not a geographical term. What that means is that a large nation, like the United States, has interests that are more extensive than geographical proximity. Why? Because today, and I quote, the US's identity is ideological, like that of the USSR in the past. Quote. Therefore, as a great nation, the US must advance its ideological interests. This means it must support liberal democracies wherever it can find them. There is no comment anywhere in this enumeration of theses of, say, support for anti-democratic forces during the post-war period, or even more recently, post-Cold War period, including Saddam Hussein. 5, the incredible military superiority of the United States vis-a-vis the nations of the rest of the world must be maintained against the rest of the world in any imaginable combination of this phrase. Now, Crystal ends this little enumeration with an oblique reference to a slightly earlier essay by Podhoretz, which was entitled Neoconservatism, a Eulogy, which argued that the movement had fulfilled its historical destiny. Podhoretz wrote this: "This is not a time for mourning or for apprehension or for anxiety, but a time for satisfaction over a just war well fought, and a time for rejoicing in a series of victories that cleared the way and set the stage for other victories in the years to come. In those victories of the future, I believe that the legacy and the legatees of neoconservatism, now zestfully thriving all around us, will play as indispensable a part as did the neoconservatives themselves in achieving the recent victories we have enjoyed." Now, Podhoretz believed neoconservatism had won in setting limits to, he goes on to explain, in setting limits to the size of the welfare state, in assuring the defense of Israel, in defending capitalism from critique, in finally defeating communism, and most importantly at home, overturning the counterculture of the anti-Vietnam protest era. And I quote him again: "Finally," he writes, "there was a realm of culture. If anti-communism was the ruling passion of the neoconservatives in foreign affairs, opposition to the counterculture of the 1960s is the neoconservatives' ruling passion at home. Indeed," he concludes, "I suspect that revulsion against the counterculture accounts for more efforts, more converts to neoconservatism than any other single factor." End of quote. So, to sum up, we must grasp the clear outlines of the neocons' very simple agenda: to make use of irrationalist politics among the American people, exploiting Americans' inherited commitment to faith-based institutions and belief systems, weaken the public educational system, and demagogically attack intellectual and scientific institutions, to delegitimize government and universities as the locales of elite action in society. Once prepared, this demos formed within the GOP, this is Crystal's argument, the GOP controls this demos controls state power to further remake US culture, closing the American mind, denying intelligence free play within politics or culture, and having seized the state, extend American empire as far as force of arms allows. High journalism records the conventional opinion that the neocons set out in rebellion against the countercultural developments of the anti-war, civil rights, and women's rights movements of the 1960s and beyond. Analyses that are more thorough reveal longer traditions behind the movement, finding US roots in the first wave of capital globalization in the 1890s, and particularly the great Professor Leo Strauss, in the European experiences of Weimar and decolonization, especially the end of the British Empire and its so-called failures in India. James Mann's best-selling report, The Rise of the Vulcans, is a fine example of the standard line. I quote this: "The neoconservative movement that arose within the Democratic Party was made up of intellectuals, scholars, and party stalwarts who had originally been strong supporters of the party's New Deal tradition. In the late 1960s and 70s, these Democrats grew increasingly unhappy with the party's drift toward the political left. The older intellectuals in the movement were joined by rising young foreign policy hawks, such as Richard Pearl, now known as the Prince of Darkness, and Paul Wolfowitz. All of them believed in the importance of American power, all hoped to revive the assertive internationalist traditions under which the Roosevelt and Truman administrations had fought World War II and the Cold War." End of the quotation. Just how they grew from these discontents to the control of expansive raw power in the state itself and state-related institutions is the subject of another best-selling work of high journalism, The Right Nation, Conservative Power in America, which details the machinations and ambitions of a small group of not very impressive minds. This book is written by the editor-in-chief of The Economist and the major American representative of The Economist in Washington. This is what they say: "The neocons are indeed a cabal with a mission. At home, they want to reform welfare and end affirmative action. Abroad comes down to two things: asserting American power in a more unilateral way, shorn of the pragmatic and, in their view, enfeebling entanglements in multilateralism, and using that power to redraw the map of the world and spread what Americans call liberal democracy. End quote. Reforming welfare and ending affirmative action, they go on to show. These are code words, and they code various forms of prejudice, but only in the rightmost wing of the right nation. Only in that rightmost wing do these prejudices dare speak their name. No doubt for many they imply the desired outcome of a white again, male again set of entitlements that rest primarily upon an unequal distribution of wealth, income, and social access, that it routinely invokes the memory of the Gilded Age of the 1890s. Not coincidentally, that was too a period of intense intellectual and state commitment to imperialism, to the priority of state power over other forms of power, and to the value of war as the vehicle of American interest and identity. The neocons' desired program has roots much deeper than the activism of FDR and Harry Truman. As I've shown elsewhere, especially through a study of Paul Wolfowitz, one of the key intellectual figures in neoconservatism, and the now disgraced head of the World Bank. Their militaristic form of American adventurism repeats almost verbatim the foundational imperial statements of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the so-called father of the American Navy and the founder of the American Naval War College. In this tradition, as Mahan and Wolfowitz insist, state intellectuals must convince Americans that war is a good and peace is not. Further, and there are quotable moments in their texts on these points. Further, they must argue, that is, American intellectuals must argue, that economy is secondary to state power and must be absorbed to the state's purpose through what Mahan called logistics, what Eisenhower 50 years later would call the military-industrial complex. Above all, Mahan explicitly, in 1898, in an article in The Atlantic, and Wolfowitz by inheritance, writing that he approves of Mahan's article in 1999, these two explicitly and implicitly accept the necessity for the extermination of populations in the name of great power, that is, American interest. Since Podhoretz in particular makes Henry Adams and other opponents' characters and values fit subject for careless mockery, and since as human beings we need to understand how to stop the formation of such creatures as these, we must hear their words to feel their characters and morals. In 2004, at the height of their power, they rarely hid any of their sentiments. Would we might repeat the phrase, pride comes before the fall.